You are the explorer? Give me a hand.
I wish to find the lost city.
What you seek is far greater than you ever imagined. It is your destiny.
Yes, that's sound from the film The Lost City of Zed, which is based on a 2009 book by the New York journalist David Grann. Now, this tells the story of an explorer named Percy Fawcett, which is a perfect name for an English explorer. He made several visits to the Amazon jungle between 1906 and 1925, searching for what he believed was an ancient city, a lost city that he named Zed. And the film is... well, it's a sumptuous epic, really, directed by James Gray. Critics Alicia Sometimes and Thomas Caldwell join us once again to discuss the journey from book to film. Hello.
Good morning.
Hello.
Welcome to the studio. So let's talk about Percy Fawcett. How's he represented in the book, Alicia?
Well, in the book, he is just the epitome of that Saturday morning serial explorer who is British, stiff upper lip, and is determined to find something amazing in the jungle. That is sort of the crust of who he is in the book. I think it sort of over-romanticises him a little bit too much, don't you think?
He's a resolute fellow, isn't he?
Resolute is the way you describe it.
I'm going to disagree with you right off the bat.
Okay.
I think the book presents him as a little bit more complex than that. I think the film goes even further, but I think the book acknowledges he was a highly flawed man who had a tendency to become obsessive. He had some very unevolved views earlier in his life, which was typical of his upbringing and, his background. I think he changed and adopted some more progressive ideas over his life. But I think the book acknowledges that to some he was this kind of heroic, stoic figure, and to others he was an obsessive tyrant. I got the feeling from the book we saw the different ways people could have regarded him.
How is the book told? So what's his name? David Grann has told this story through David Grann's own eyes. Is that how it works?
Well, he alternates chapter by chapter telling. He sort of uses very literary non-fiction style writing to tell Percy's story, and then the alternate chapters it's David Grann describing his own research and some of his own trip to the Amazon to try to make sense of what happened.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with you that he's a completely complex character. I'm just saying on first glance that he is this archetypal explorer. It's from that era where he's known all around the world for his exploring, but in the end, and certainly when he goes missing on his last trip, he's definitely a complex character. He is. It mentions how he's the son of a Victorian aristocrat who became an alcoholic, and his time during his time in the army, he is seen as probably less than, and feels this need to explore to make something more of himself, and he gets the exploring bug when he's located in Ceylon, of course Sri Lanka, and he wants to go to well, first it's a border dispute between Bolivia, Brazil and Peru. So he goes to the Amazon jungle for that purpose. But it's when he goes there for his first trip that...
The purpose being to draw a map that will help resolve this dispute.
Right.
It's just a job.
It's just a job.
He goes there because that's his employment. Yeah.
And as he delves further into this, he has some amazing experiences in the jungle. He realises that perhaps there is this lost city of Zed, that perhaps there is this lost civilization, and then as his trips progress, as he gets older, it becomes madder and madder and madder.
I think what's interesting is Fawcett for a long time had been dismissed as a sort of minor footnote in history.
Right, yeah.
And I think the book has done a lot to try to redeem him or elevate his status. And I think the film actually then takes the edge of that again. I think the film then does present him as a more complex figure than you get in the book. What I found really interesting is I think the book focuses on this idea that, yes, he became obsessed with finding the city, but his motivation was very strongly driven by his belief through his own encounters and eyewitness events that that the tribal people of the Amazon were a very sophisticated civilization, and the book maybe oversells the idea that he had very progressive ideals about trying to challenge the English aristocracy and authority on this idea of the savages being a subclass of humans. That there's this idea that it was a very noble pursuit to try to elevate the status of the tribal people.
So according to the book, where did he get this idea that there was this lost city of Zed? What seeded this idea in him?
There's many things, one being that the guides that helped him through the forest mentioned this lost civilization, that there was a mention of it. There was artifacts that he found that...
all the bits of pottery.
That he found that he thought this could be it. There was just lots of little things that became like that. Also, when he went back to England, he saw psychics. Madame Blavatsky is one of them that he saw, who kept mentioning this lost city, and more he becomes obsessed. Not just that it is this lost civilization that you were talking about, where it predates anything European. It becomes this sort of almost not aliens, but it's very.
The book implies there's something possibly mystic about
it.
Yeah. But also, I mean, during his lifetime, a lot of beliefs and myths were debunked. Like, it was believed that nobody could live in the Amazon. And while he was there, he saw the very sophisticated farming methods of many tribal people. While he was exploring, Machu Picchu was discovered, and that was thought to be an impossibility. So these kind of strongly held beliefs about the jungle being impossible to live in and impossible to sustain life or any significant civilization, he actually witnessed this stuff being debunked. So that, again, kind of, I think, propelled his desire to find this city.
This is Books and Arts on RN, and we're talking about the book The Lost City of Zed, which is by a New York journalist called David Gran, and it's just been made into a film. It's the story of Percy Fawcett, and with me are Thomas Caldwell and Alicia Sometimes, who help us chart the journey that these stories make from book to film. Now, there is another book about Fawcett, which I read ages ago, actually. So in the, when was it now? In the early 90s, I did some research at the Royal Geographical Society where some of this action is held.
Which Percy was a member of.
Yes. And it's still a bit like that today, I have to say. Well, I don't want to be rude about them because they're very hospitable and helpful, but it was a sort of eccentric old world kind of place. And a chap there told me about Fawcett, Exploration Fawcett, and they were sort of torn between whether he was the last of the great 19th century style explorers or whether he was just an eccentric. And I don't know whether he gave me a book or I bought a book shortly after, which is called Exploration Fawcett, that was compiled by his son Brian. He had two sons, one who died with him on their final expedition and the one who survived. And in 1957, Brian put together what he said were his father's writings, which are very lush. And when you read them, it's hard to believe they were written by someone who wasn't a trained writer, actually. It's quite surprising. And what I took away from it was that he was a mystic, a follower of theosophy, and very, very influenced by Rider Haggard, who wrote King Solomon's Mines. And King Solomon's Mines was viewed by some people in the late 19th and early 20th century as a sort of work of revelation, as if it was almost mystically inspired to take you not just into the idea of lost civilizations beyond what was then called savagery, but that it was linked to theosophy, to some whole notion of the past. And what Haggard was interested in was that the civilization seemed to him to be in decay. So he said civilization is but savagery, silver gilt. Or gold, or not silver gilt, that doesn't make sense. Gilt, that it was, we were all the same clay, really. So it wasn't really endorsing the idea of savagery at all. And I thought that that Fawcett was really a kind of, almost a disciple of theosophy and of Haggard, that's what's driving him to some extent. But of course, I don't know. We've just got, the dilemma we're in is that there are now these three versions.
I think there's more than that as well. I think, other people have written about this too. This is the wonderful problem of history, and it's what makes exploring the past such a joy, isn't it? Trying to weigh up these different accounts. even primary sources contradict each other, and it's especially when the primary sources come from people who vanished into the jungle and have still never been found or fully accounted for. It's you can see why it's such an enticing mystery to so many people.
And Brian sort of carries the torch and really believes in what his father was doing, and that's why he wanted to write that book, and that was critically acclaimed in its time. And his Percy's wife Nina carried the torch as well, and to her up until her death was collecting every last bit of information she could, still believing that perhaps they were alive, even though she died some 30 years later.
So let's talk about the film, because Percy's wife, what's her name?
Nina.
Nina, that's right. Is an astonishing character. She's the most patient woman in the world, because her husband, who's a hunky guy, is no sooner home than he's off planning another expedition back to the Amazon. Basically, he comes home, they make love, she gets pregnant, and he goes away, and when he comes back, there's another kid. That's not exactly what happens, but that's a bit of a pattern. And we should say, not only does he go off to the Amazon on however many times it is, 4 or 5 times, he also manages to go and serve on the Somme.
Yes,
in
between.
the First World War, where he miraculously doesn't get killed. So I guess he must have a fairly robust sense of his own indestructibility.
Well, that's actually something that's mentioned in the book. He seemed to have some uncanny ability not to fall prey to the same diseases and afflictions that so many people in these expeditions suffered, and that kind of carried on into the First World War as well. He did have some kind of remarkable constitution, apparently. The film touches on the fact that Nina, his wife, was very much part of that early wave of feminism, who was actually frustrated with the fact that she was unable to do things that he could do.
In the movie, she wants to go with him.
And that's really overt in the film, as she does confront him and just say, I have put my entire life on hold and basically cancelled my ambition to look after the house and the home and the children while you're off having these adventures. And that's one of the many elements I actually really liked about the film. It acknowledges this very unromantic aspect of the expedition life, that these men went off and had these great adventures and the family were left to fend for themselves. And in real life, the family ended up in abject poverty. I mean, that they weren't provided for. They didn't receive fame, fortune or glory in the end. It was actually quite a sad whimper what happened to the family.
Yeah, it was a small stipend she got. In real life, she did go to Brazil for a bit to be with him, but not obviously. He would not let her go on these travels. And Sienna Miller does an amazing job.
Really underrated actor.
Yeah,
I
really
like her
underrated
a lot.
actor.
Yeah.
But again, still to my dislike, she plays too many characters where she's quite, passive. The man is going off adventuring. I'd like to see her in a different role. But Nina is his strength. It's his rock. It's quite interesting because a lot of the other explorers don't want to go off once they're married. And one of his sidekicks, Henry Costin, played by Robert Pattinson, who is unrecognisable, gone from his days of Twilight to this, what he looks like a 45-year-old man.
I caught it when the Twilight thing was happening and everybody was beating up on people like Robert Pattinson and Kristen Stewart. I called it. I said, those two actors are going to go on to great things.
Yeah.
And we should. And he really proves himself in this film. Yeah.
Just briefly in the time we've got left, let's explain how James Gray has approached turning this very baggy story into a streamlined film. How's he dealt with that?
Well, massively condensing the material. All the kind of first-hand account by by author David Gran has been removed. And I think Fawcett went into the jungle, maybe 7 or 8 times?
Yeah.
He's reduced that to 3, so he's radically condensed narrative and characters. He's merged characters together.
He's made a composite of Henry Costin.
The Robert Pattinson Costin character is a few different people rolled into one. I think he's done quite a good job, actually, and I think the 3 journeys into the jungle nicely captured the three different types of experiences he had while he was there. And he's really amped up the politics of what was going on. I think this is very much a revisionist film that looks at issues of class and race and gender. It is quite overt with dealing with the history of Western people going in and obliterating the natural resources of the Amazon. They reference the rubber trade. They reference slavery.
Yeah, I mean, the rubber trade was even more brutal than we see in the film. The rubber trade was just disgusting.
The film actually holds back compared to the book on what happened to the tribal people. And it looks at the way that Percy Fawcett really advocated for this idea that we need to treat the tribal people with respect. And I mean, a lot of people would just go in guns blazing. He was, if we believe the account in the novel and the film, he was very ahead of his time for very much trying to go in and establish friendships and bonds rather than opening fire. So
Alicia, what about your take on the film? Are you glowing in your praise?
No, I'm not. Although I did think the cinematic, it was beautiful and the acting was incredible. I think that, to me, we'd be remiss not to mention that there's a lot of criticism of Percy Fawcett, and that I just found the movie too romantic of who he was. And I think that the book, even though it's non-fiction and we get Grant's account and his version of Percy, it's a very interior world, and I found the film too exterior, and I just kind of didn't feel that we got the weight that the book had. But I don't know, because I ended up being quite bored and wondered what the film was about. Whereas the book, I felt that this was a really interesting story.
You're not alone for saying that, but I'm going to agree with the English film critic Lee Singer, who in Sight and Sound described this as an intimate epic and even compared it to Lawrence of Arabia, which might horrify some people. But I think it is very much focused on the psychology of this man. And I think we do see an evolution. I mean, he does express some pretty primitive ideas in the film, and we see a change of character. I think this is a classic case of printing the legend rather than printing the truth.
Yes.
But as a sort of work, as a kind of political work of entertainment, I quite enjoyed it, and I got swept up by the end of it. I was actually surprisingly moved. I think the romanticisation definitely comes in there at the end. I mean, the fact that his final trip was with his son, who had no experience with any of this, does not get critiqued enough in the film or the book.
Book or film?
Book.
I think they're both marvellous.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think they're both quite different, and I found they complemented each other for me nicely.
I would say read all three, read 2 books and the film, or don't bother. But it opens up, masterpiecey. But it did open up, a story.
Oh, exploring is an amazing thing. I would have loved to have seen the juxtaposition with a GPS, car, plane driving David Grant and The Lost City.
Yeah. All good stuff. Alicia Sometimes and Thomas Caldwell join us from time to time to talk about the journey that we make from book to film. The Lost City of Zed by David Graham, that's published by Simon & Schuster, and the movie is directed by James Gray. And Thomas, it's out on limited release, is it? Do we know about the details?
Yeah, it's only in a small handful of cinemas per state.
Okay.